Hi, I'm Lisa Ashigala, Director of Engagement at Tamarack Institute, and I'm so excited to have Living City's Chief Impact Officer, Tynesia Boyea-Robinson, joining me today. Ty has just released a new book, Just Change: How to Collaborate for Lasting Impact. And in it, she shares stories and case studies focused on innovative and collaborative approaches to large-scale social change. Today, we will learn more about this new piece of work and look at leaders from across the country who have successfully created sustainable, long-lasting solutions to address key root causes of inequities in their communities. Welcome, Ty.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me. So I'm just going to take a little bit of time today to go over the slides, and then we're going to open it for Q&A. I really want to thank Tamarack for having us. We always enjoy sharing some of our learnings with everyone working with Tamarack. I also want to acknowledge that one of my colleagues, Jeff Raderstrong, is on the phone, and so he will be tweeting as well and responding from our at Living Cities website. So let's give a little bit of background, but not too much. Why did we write a book, Just Change? One of the reasons why, this is Nadia Owusu, and one of the things that Living Cities is committed to and has been for a while now is what we call open sourcing social change. And what that basically means is our CEO, Ben Heck, says that knowledge should be a public good, that we should be able to share what's working, what's not working, and why across the country, so people can learn from what works with leaders who are driving change and what didn't. And so you'll notice in the date on this blog post that was about 3 years ago. And for 3 years, we've been working on open sourcing, and we wanted to consolidate all of those stories and all of that learning in a way that would help other communities doing similar things. My colleague, Jeff Raderstrong, who's on the phone, has been a pivotal leader in that open sourcing social change effort at Living Cities. I also want to say I'm hearing some background noise, so if anyone could mute their phone, that would be helpful. So that's why Just Change from a Living City standpoint. If you think about my role in Just Change, in many ways I'm narrating the stories of others, but I'm also sharing my own stories from doing this work over the past couple of decades. And so what I've seen in my own personal experiences, I've gone to good schools. I've worked in a lot of different industries. I started my own company. I've launched my own social enterprise. And one of the things I kept seeing over and over again, no matter what industry I was in, is that so many communities are starting from scratch on things that have already been learned in social change. And that was just starting to drive me nuts. So the opportunity to bring together the learning and experience I had in the private, the social sector, and the public sector with the deep investment that Living Cities had done on many years before I even joined really helped out me a lot, because I believe that our country's intractable problems are not only solvable, but that people across the country have found ways to do that every day. And some of what it's going to take to just change is be really better and smarter about sharing those stories with others so people can learn from and with each other real time. So that gives you a little bit of the background about why we did Just Change. So if you think about the conversation today, first I'm going to give an overview of each of the chapters, just a really high-level overview. And we have an idea of what everyone is interested in based on who signed up for the webinar. So I'm going to go deep on one particular chapter so we have a chance to dig into it a little bit more. So the book is broken up into 6 chapters, and if you can tell, we like the word change. So you're going to see change a lot. But hopefully you won't just see it in the writing, you'll also see it in your communities. So if you think about the first thing, change how you think about change. Not only are we using change a lot, but really some of it comes down to your mindset. And there's 3 major things. 1, you have to understand what the problem is and then apply those tools. 2, you have to look at the problems from a system standpoint to create change. And 3, you have to use data to drive change. So high level on each of those, and then I'll give an example. And that's going to be the format that we follow for each of these slides. We've worked really hard in the book to try to make it accessible and try to make sure that people understood who might not be able to be on a Tamarack webinar, or who maybe hadn't gone to a collective impact conference. And so when I say understand the problem, many of you are probably familiar with Donella Meadows' version of what does it take to drive systems change. And there's this whole concept of complex problems and simple problems and complicated problems. And people write a lot about, is this a complicated problem or a complex problem? But instead of spending a lot of time talking about what the problem is, the real crux is, what is the type of problem you're trying to solve, so you know what kind of tools you need to use to solve it. Regardless of whether or not for the particular thing you're focused on, whether like some of you on the phone it's health, like others of you on the phone it's education, or it's workforce development, it's not enough to just solve the problem from a programmatic approach. You really have to think about it from a systems level. And one of my backgrounds is an electrical engineer and computer science double major. And engineers think and work in systems. So I can share a little bit more about that with examples, but it's really about if, let's say I was working on a locomotive, which I did in the past life. It doesn't matter if you've got the best engine ever if it doesn't connect with the actual body type of the locomotive, because it won't move. And lots of times people are working on their projects as if they're in separate silos, instead of using a systems approach, which is bringing all of those things together in service of one outcome and one goal, or a set of outcomes and goals. The last piece is using data to drive change. And I've been in multiple sectors. And so one of the things I would say about the social sector is that I learned really soon by annoying a lot of people that sometimes data is not the best way to start a conversation. And one of my mentors told me really early on, no one cares how much you know if they don't know how much you care. And I'm always inspired by the people who invest so much of their time and energy in improving their communities, and often with very little resources. That said, one of the things I've always been really committed to, especially having been a Six Sigma Black Belt at General Electric and working for lots of for-profit companies where you can't do your work without data, is that the private sector is so focused on having data for making widgets. How much more important is it for us to be focused on having the data we need to make sure that people, their families, and their communities are better? So if you think about changing how you think about change, one of the examples I have is before I worked at Living Cities, I worked on a workforce development project in DC. And the main thing there was we were working with a for-profit company who was looking to increase their workforce by a factor of 10. There was no way any one of those nonprofit communities could have met that goal. And so some of changing how they thought about change and working with them was working together to achieve the goal from a systems standpoint. So each one of the nonprofits not only had to figure out how to build connective tissue amongst their programs. Some of the programs were really, really good at people self-actualizing themselves and having a vision. Others of the programs focused very specifically on industries. Some of the programs focused really specifically on particular populations, like people who used to be adjudicated. Every single piece of those programs had something that benefited the community, and none of them by themselves could have met the goal of several thousand employees that this retailer was looking to hire. And so one part of the system change for that group was figuring out how they worked together to have a shared pipeline to serve the needs of the private sector. The other piece of the system was also working closely with the public sector. So you cannot work around the public sector if you're looking for lasting change. In this example, we started realizing that there were some workforce development policies that actually were making it hard for the private sector to engage directly with a nonprofit. So those were some of the things we had to handle from the system standpoint. Another piece was the employer from a system standpoint. There were some policies on their books that made it difficult for certain populations, particularly those who were past adjudicated, to work there, even if they had gone through a program that was really strong at making sure people were solid. So in this instance, every single piece of the system had to work together and coordinate towards outcomes. And the thing that held us all together was that we were very transparent with each other about what was working, what was not working, and why, by sharing which people from which programs worked really well and what jobs, and then making sure we all made changes to our programs or changes to policies or changes to practices, regardless of who you were. So that's how we had to change how we thought about change. When the next section is change how you create change, and I realized that I got really in-depth on that example, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit because I know the meat that people are probably interested in is the one that we have at the end. So on change how you create change, you'll notice that there are 4 buckets on there. Focus on bright spots, which that information and that concept came from the Heath Brothers book around switch, how to have big change from incremental changes. So that's a book I recommend. Also create cross-sector partnerships, which I talked a little bit about in the other example. But the ones I'm going to focus on in the next example is to define success in terms of people and not neighborhoods, and to share ownership with the community to create equity. So for those of you on the phone, a lot of you have heard of collective impact. Some people hate the term. People are like, oh, backlash to collective impact. Rawr! But let's put that down for a second and remind ourselves that in the early 90s, a phenomenon called Harlem Children's Zone was started by Geoffrey Canada. And this at the time was revolutionary because the way Geoffrey Canada's organization decided that they were going to focus on increasing educational outcomes for children was to actually look at it from all the different drivers of what it takes to have education working. So they did everything from the student and their education goals to the actual environment that they lived in to what were their parents working on. And so that concept of it's not enough to just invest in your community if it's not having outcomes on children was huge. And it was the child is at the center of this work, and you move backwards from the child and what the challenges are that you're trying to face. So there's a false choice, is it people or place? It's both. But the thing that we keep learning in communities is that the communities that focus on people and make sure that they always come back to, did this young person, did this parent, did this individual who's looking to be employed, did their lives improve as a result of the work that we did? And what is the data that says that we can get there? Those are the communities that have the lasting impact and the ones that actually build those solutions from the community up. And that was what made the Harlem Children's Zone model so successful. And for those of you who are familiar with President Obama's Strong Cities, Strong Communities initiative, that is the blueprint of which that federal policy was actually created. The next section on change how your organization works is one of my favorites because that is the thing that, you know, it's the part that a lot of times I find really exciting, but it's the piece that people often miss, which is really about how this work works is really about keeping people glued together. If you work for somebody, they pay your paycheck. Sooner or later, you have an incentive to stay. If you work for somebody, there is a boss. Sooner or later, that person is going to tell you, this is working or this isn't. It's pretty clear what you got to do. When you're doing cross-sector collaborations, every day people can choose to opt out. And so the really important thing is to get people to want to work together, to get people comfortable being vulnerable with each other, to get people open to what's working and what's not. And that is why you have to spend so much time on tapping into people's intrinsic motivation. Why are you here? What motivates you? And how do we tap into that? And also making sure that people are not just spouting forth sunshine and rainbows. You're just great. I love you. Or they're not just spouting forth vitriol. Oh my God, I can't stand that person. They're trying to destroy us all. And so the work really comes down to people. So when you think about that, for me and my experience with that, my first experience with pulling together something from a systems change standpoint was actually when I was the founding executive director of a program that worked with young adults called Year Up. So I launched the DC site. We were really excited to have the president there and come. So like, if you can't tell, I'm totally, completely fangirling next to him. And so that's kind of embarrassing. But we were super excited because as a result of the president coming there, we got interns at the White House. And for us and our organization at that time in our life, that would have been enough. But we had a couple of people around us that said, it is not enough if Year Up just serves young people well. What does it mean for you not to need a Year Up? What would you have to do differently to start the problem from the beginning? Well, that had to come from people willing to give us feedback and tell us, you guys are cool, but you ain't all that, all right? Like, you're not the only solution to this problem. The answer is not Year Up. The answer is, what does it mean for every young person to have an opportunity? And as a result of having that intrinsic motivation that we tapped into amongst each other with a peer group, that was part of the reauthorization of the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, but also a part of the group that helped do the Social Innovation Fund called America Forward. We worked together above and beyond just Year Up and helped make sure that we changed Workforce Investment Opportunity Act policy. Now, for those of you who are in workforce, I know it's not completely working yet, so don't get out your pitchforks, but it's the type of thing that if you're thinking about more than yourself and more than your organization, when you have the right partners around you, it will push you to actually solve the problem at its source and not just say the answer to the problem is your organization. The next is change how you collaborate, and I'm going to speed through this one because this is where we have our example later on, so I want to make sure we get to it. But there are a couple of things around. I've said outcomes a lot. What we say at Living Cities is shared result. There are so many people that say so many different things. Tomato, tomato. Outcomes, results, goals, whatever it is, it's clearly defined on what the heck you guys are there trying to achieve. And then you say, if we are trying to increase healthy outcomes amongst children of color in this particular school, who are the people that we need around the table to do that? That's why you have to think intentionally about your partners. You also have to make sure that the results, not the egos, not what you're used to doing, not the people who are your best friends and you like hanging out with them, like the results are at the center of your work, and you have to invest in everyone knowing what the heck people are talking about. So one of the tools that we have to do that, this is something called the wedding seating chart. We have lots of different tools in our book, but this is in there, and it's a way to start to visualize, if I were at a wedding, who would be at my table? And it's a non-threatening way to think about, all right, we want everybody there, but, you know, Cousin Ray Ray gets a little loud, so I'm going to put him in the back of the room. And Aunt Janet actually really likes my cousin Nina, so I'm going to put them at this table. Those are the types of things, they sound kind of basic, but those are the types of things you actually have to do to change how you collaborate, because the way people work together, how well they enjoy working with each other, and making sure that you're thoughtful about who's at the table and why and what they're working on is pretty essential to achieving your goals. The next section is change how your collaborative does its work. So when you think about making sure that you guys are continuously improving, what a lot of people say is, this is our goal. It's going to be reduce the number of people who have been in prison by 10% in 5 years, let's say. Actually, most people wouldn't say an ambitious goal like that, but let's say you did. Well, let's say you find out that that was a psycho goal. Like, there's no way you can meet that goal. Why? Because the strategy that you picked didn't work, and so you need to try something else. Or maybe it was about, the initial thought was that you had to do something about criminal justice, but when you sat down with folks, they said, actually, our biggest problem is not criminal justice, our biggest problem is transportation. So you have to be willing to constantly revisit and look at what you're doing and the data to continuously improve. And so one of the tools that we were introduced to several years ago was the National Equity Atlas by PolicyLink. And the thing that's really important about data, people always say disaggregate data by race, but it's important because you need to make sure that you're mindful of, hey, if my data says 80% of young people are thriving, but when you break down that data, it consists of 100% of people from this one group and 5% of another group. Don't judge my math. I know that didn't make sense, but it just helps you have to make sure that you're looking at how your work is working for everyone, and then continuously improving to make sure that you're closing those gaps. The next one, and this one is another one that I enjoy. And so I've mentioned before that I have a private sector background and that I've started several different businesses. So this is one that is a little bit of foreign territory for many groups doing this work. So changing how you resource your collaboration, making sure that you're getting funding streams from multiple funders. People initially think, oh, so yeah, that's federal government, and that's local government, and that's national funders, and that's local funders. And I'm talking about not just government, not just nonprofit or philanthropy, but also private sector. Not just grants, but also loans. You cannot grant your way out of the size of the problems we have. And private sector and public sector have some of the largest dollars that you can ever use to these challenges. So what are the ways that you can actually work together with those groups in a way that helps drive your outcomes? Impact investing and pay for success are particular examples of how to do multiple funders and diverse investors. But the example I'm going to give is actually the work that I had worked on way before Living Cities, which, as you can tell, I always use colloquialisms. So how you want to make your business make more money? Start valuing values. Now it's really popular to save the world. If you've noticed, I'm going to go on a little rant. So I was watching the Super Bowl, and there's a Stella Artois commercial about how, and Matt Damon was there, who was absolutely gorgeous, and he was saying that this beer company is a water conservation company. Well, if that's true, I'm a monkey's uncle. But all I'm saying is when I was starting to tweet about doing well and doing good and businesses investing in their communities in 2013, that wasn't very popular. When I was talking then in 2013 about people leveraging their for-profit ventures in a way that drove social goals, that wasn't very popular. I'm here to tell you today, if Melissa McCarthy is driving a hybrid vehicle and that means she's changing the world, that means that there is more of an appetite right now for companies who are focused on things that do well and do good. It's not going to be necessarily in everybody's comfort zone, but think about ways that doing work with the private sector actually not only helps them advance their goals, but also helps invest in the work that you're doing. So now I'm going to get into the meaty piece, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So whenever I'm on these calls, I'm like, yeah. Oh, that was an interesting comment. Yeah. Okay, well, how does that work? So this is the, okay, well, how does that work section. And if you guys don't love it, you can always tell me when you start doing Q&A. So I promised we would go to change how you collaborate. And that's mainly because a lot of folks in this call focus on collective impact, collective action, or whatever the heck you want to call it. So here's a particular example of how we do that in our own portfolio. So we work backwards from the shared result. What is the result your community is trying to achieve? And then it is a long-term game. And so one of the things that our communities have found helpful is for us to say, okay, this is the shared result. It is your bold end game. It is your big, hairy, audacious goal. It is your gulp factor. It is how the heck are we going to get there? It's that. But then how do you know you're succeeding along the way? There are different buckets of activities and outcomes that you'll see over time. So the 6 to 10 year outcomes are the things that it's going to take a while to see move, but you'll really know you're getting there. The 3 to 6 year outcomes are the intermediate steps. And the key drivers, we tried to make it very simple. Some folks call those things metrics. Some folks call those things, performance measures. The key drivers are the impact of your intervention. And so our sites have found it really helpful to start to see if you take your strategies and you apply them to the long-term goal, you should see that your short-term solutions are starting to build on themselves. So your 3 to 6 year and your 6 to 10 year outcomes are trending in the right direction. If they are not, that's fine, as long as you're understanding what's working, what's not working, and why. And you need to collect the data that's going to inform you of that so you can change your direction if you need to. So that's a lovely slide. People love that one. They're like, ooh, spinny, can I have a copy? but I'll give you actually an example. So this is Hope SF, which is one of our investments. And Hope SF, their shared result, when you think about making sure the neighborhood piece is together, they're addressing the issue of unemployment rate. And they're also addressing the issue of the fact that there are a lot of people of color who now are being forced out of the community because it's too expensive. So that happy spinny slide for San Francisco looks like this. And if you can't read it, it's okay, because I think they're going to send you some slides. But what you'll see is their shared result is by 2020, we quadrupled the number of formerly public housing households of color that are thriving in the city. That is huge. I want to tell you right now, that one little green bubble took about 6 months. 6 months, y'all. 6 months to get to. Why? Because the public housing people wanted to talk about housing. Oh, we're going to build X number of things of affordable housing. And the concept of yes, and what happens to the people in those housing? Yes, and what happens to them? What do you want for the people in those houses? And then we started having really interesting discussions like, well, what we want for the people in our housing project is to not be in our housing project, to not need a housing project. Oh, well, what would that look like? What would have to change? So it can be a really hard conversation. This lovely side that's really pretty with green and purple and blue is really intense conversations with lots of people who don't talk to each other. So we finally got the housing people to say, all right, success might look like you're not here anymore. High five, we're okay with that. Then we got the developer people on the table like, hey, what do you think about the shared result? Because we're co-creating it together. And the developer people were like, well, how does that tie to units of housing? And so we just kept going over and over again and iterating. But what San Francisco decided based on their cross-sector table is that the key root causes of what was driving employment challenges and people not thriving was a combination of education, health, and employment. And all of those things were working together or against each other for the young people and their families and their communities. So when you think about that spinny slide I showed before, they said, okay, so our strategies are going to be focused on the root causes that we saw that are keeping people from being successful. So it is equitable mixed income development. And developers were like, yay, high five. But it's also family-focused community building. And that came from the residents themselves. They said it has to be safe and it has to be enjoyable to be in these neighborhoods. And we also have to have health and wellness integrated into the development. We also need to make sure that education is up front and part of the DNA and culture of our environment, and that there are pathways for economic mobility. So those are the strategies they agreed on. Now let me tell you something. When we do this work, there are several days where you basically say these are all the potential things we could possibly do, and everyone always wants to do all of them all at once. And what we always say is you have to sequence. So start with your things that you're going to do first, and over time, if you are successful, you can sequence to the other pieces. So once they have those strategies together, you'll start to see that their key drivers are things that make people happy. As the short story, I can point to hospitalizations. I can point to wages. I can point to high school. They're the things that feel very tangible. But the farther up on the chart you go, the more it starts to get a little more overwhelming. Well, wait a minute. Workforce participation rate and chronic disease rates? You know how many things go into that? Absolutely. That's why there's 6 to 10 and 3 to 6 years. And this helps hold communities accountable to everyone wants to high five as they should when the key drivers are moving in the right direction. But if over time in these long-term investments, you aren't seeing a change in preterm birth percentage rate, why? Is it that it's the wrong strategy? Is it that the strategy is not being implemented well? Has something big happened where that's no longer relevant? If you do not tie your immediate short-term interventions into the long-term goals that they are trying to drive and consistently look back at that, you fall prey to everyone being so short-term focused on the strategies and pretending like the long-term goal is just a magical thing that we all want to get there one day, but we probably won't see it in our lifetime. So that is the way that the actual spinny wheel slide, the outcome slide, works in a community. And then this is how, the trauma-informed community building is an example of one of the strategies. And so you'll see that if you open that document, or if you look that up, you'll see the specific strategies. It's very granular. There's lots of nitty-gritty in there. But we also invest in the data for each of those sites across those. So you probably can't see it directly in the slide, but for every outcome they have that's at the 6 to 10 year level, the high level outcomes, those you don't have to collect necessarily locally. Some of those you can pull together for communities. And so that's some of the benefit that Living Cities brings when we invest in those communities. So for every community, we have something like this. And they're not all the same, but we are preferencing jobs, income, and wealth right now in the communities. And every community has a different reason or a different way to get to those outcomes. But the fact that we're all looking at them together, we're defining what success looks like, and we're constantly interrogating ourselves to see if we're making progress, that's the difference on what actually creates lasting impact. So I know I went through a whole bunch of stuff, and the book is really short. I tried to make it something that you could read through quickly. But if you want to learn more about it, go to this website. And we also have a lot of the tools that we profiled in the book in ways that you can download them. So that's why you would go to tools.changeForImpact.org, and you can buy them on Amazon if you like them. So here's the Q&A point, and I'm going to say Jeff will be answering questions as well.
Thanks so much, Ty. So we now have the opportunity to open up the floor, and you can ask Ty any specific questions that you have. So as a reminder, if you've joined us online, you can write your questions in the question box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel, or you can tweet questions using the hashtag TamaracConnect, or you can email questions to stephanie@tamaraccommunity.ca. So I have a number of questions, so I'm going to kick it off while we wait for some other questions to come in. I also want to mention that all of the resources, the slides, and any of those resources that Ty mentioned will be sharing out after this session in a couple days, so you'll have access to all of those as well. So one of my questions is, Ty, you talked a lot about making sure that the data that we're measuring is really measuring the system rather than the individual programs. Can you share any tips for how to get started, how to get that data together for the whole system?
Sure. So I'll give a few ideas, and then I'll ask Jeff, because he actually developed a resource about data that might be helpful for folks. So one of the things is, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Everyone always wants the perfect data. There is no such thing as the perfect data. There's also a spreadsheet within the book, and probably in Tools for Impact, where it has 3 buckets for data that help people think about it. What data do we have? What data do we need? And what data would we love? That kind of helps people a little bit on, all right, well, let's use what we have, let's see if we can get what we need, and then let's put on paper what we'd love to have, but know that we might not get there. So that helps. And then I think the other thing is, it's not don't use the strategy data. You need both. It's just that most communities go straight to the strategy data and get overwhelmed by the systems level data. And that was the whole point of having key drivers 3 to 6 and 6 to 10, to show that you need a spectrum of the data working together in order to know not just if your interventions are working at the strategy level, but what the ripple effects of those impacts are on the system at large. Jeff, would you add anything else from the blog series that you wrote?
No, I would say, if you guys want to dive deeper into that question specifically, feel free to go to livingcities.org to explore that. And I think one of the big takeaways is how is, unique and specific. A lot of the data needs are to a specific community, and so there's some very general takeaways that we have online, but that a lot of it is just the hard work of sort of making those relationships, like Ty was alluding to earlier, and figuring out where the data lives, what data do you need, and then sort of how to use it going forward to get to your shared result or your lasting impact or whatever you're trying to achieve.
Great. So my next question also would be, you also talked a lot about how the private sector is such a valuable resource. And it's something that we're seeing a lot of people paying attention to and realizing the value of that cross-sectoral collaborations. Can you share any tips about, if people are starting out and really wanting, they're seeing a gap, in when they're looking at their seating chart, their wedding seating chart, and they're saying, hey, we really want to bring the private sector in. Do you have any tips for kind of how to go about that, how to find organizations that are aligned on similar issues, anything to share about how to bring those private sector folks in?
Absolutely. I wrote a Stanford Social Innovation Review several years back about this very thing, and it's something I specialized in the business I started, Reliance Methods. So I'll give you one tip, but there's deeper tools in that one. So private sector companies can be organized in 3 buckets. If private sector folks you're looking for are either experiencing growth in some way. So, hey, this is a new industry, so we need to hire a lot of people. Hey, we just got a whole bunch of business, so we need such and such. They are experiencing challenges. Oh my gosh, we just were in the paper for something really bad. We got to fix this. Or they have a mandate, which is the example of, if you want to come into this community, then you have to do X, Y, Z. Of those 3, the third is the least helpful, honestly, because it's not driven by an internal business need, it's a mandate. And the third is the way most communities work with the private sector. So if you focused on the first 2, growth or trouble, it's an interesting way to segment the private sector, because it's less about the industry, it's less about what size they are, and more about, is there something that you're doing that can help them with one of those 2 needs? So that's one, generic way of thinking about the private sector. The second generic way of thinking about the private sector is, how does what I'm doing benefit what they do? Some of those things are easier. The easiest one of all is workforce. Every private sector needs talent. Everybody needs talent. It's not just the private sector. So that's the easiest one to do, but there's also focus areas. So if you're a health organization and the group does health, that's an overlap. You should look on all your health industry pieces. If you are an environmental organization and it's a group that works on environment, it's like that simple. So you go and you prospect private sector companies that way. The segment that I mentioned in the example is a new segment. It's a growing segment called, we have research that calls them social purpose businesses. I've written about them for 6+ years and talk about values-driven entrepreneurs, but there are more and more businesses that are being launched by people that want to both do well and do good. That's an interesting segment that hasn't yet grown as much as it could yet, but they are a really ripe audience for this type of work.
Great. So just a reminder, everyone, please type your questions into the question box. It seems we have a really captivated group, but not a very talkative one. So we do invite your questions. When I was reading the book, which I really, really enjoyed, there was one quote that I wrote down, and I'd love for you to kind of talk more about it. You wrote, "When it comes to cross-sector partnerships, you can sit around a table all singing the same song from the same hymn book for a long, long time without ever accomplishing anything." And so this resonated a lot with me, and I know how important momentum is. So I understand that kind of why you're singing the songs from the songbook. But my question is, what advice do you have to really move to results and action? Any wisdom you can share with how to take people who are singing from the same songbook and really move them to action?
So there is this toy that I always forget the name of it. Is it a Hobart? Jeff, do you remember the toy that goes up and down, like expands and contracts?
Yeah, I don't know. Can't remember the name either.
Okay, I never remember the name, but it's this toy that, like, when you pull it out, it's like a big circle, and then when you squish it, it looks like a little star cube. I never remember the name of it. Hobart something. The best way to think about this work is like that toy. So it would be good if I could find the toy. And it's that you bring together the whole big group. And that's like the toy when the ball is at its biggest. But then when you do the work, sometimes it contracts to a shorter group. It's called the Hoberman. The Hoberman Sphere. That's what it is. And when it contracts, that's what happens when people kind of put their heads down on certain bodies of work. So the problem is you need everybody at the table to be ready, almost like put me in the game, coach, I'm ready to go. But there are only a certain number of people on the field at the time. So you have to be mindful of, like, keeping everybody on board with the playbook. This is the playbook. This is where we're going. This is our game plan. Does everyone know that? Yes. Okay, now these are the people on the field right now. Your turn on the field is in a little bit. So it's that question I said earlier about sequencing. Sequencing and prioritizing your action helps you keep momentum and allows people to say, it's not my turn to be in yet, but I'm in the game, so I know I will be tagged in. And that's the difference. Lots of times when people are all singing from the same songbook but not doing anything, it's because a cross-sector partnership is keeping that Hoberman Sphere at the biggest circle for a really long time. And you just can't move work as fast without having smaller groups of folks around outcomes deployed and coming back, deployed and coming back.
Okay. So we have some questions coming through. So one of the questions was in response to one of your previous comments, an agreement that people at the table and their motivation is critical to that change process. But what if some organizational leaders are reluctant to support change or actively sabotage, and that they would say everything's fine here?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is just because we all are working together on the same outcomes doesn't mean it's not going to get a little crazy at times. And so one of the pieces that's important of, if your outcomes are at the center of the work, you've got to have a coalition of the willing. That means people will spin off your tables. That means there are times when people are not going to be at the table for the right reason. And if the outcomes are at the center, the outcomes are what allows you to say, hey, I know that's what you want to do, but how is that going to advance our outcomes or not? Those are the adaptive leadership things about tough conversations. It's easy to say. What that feels like in the moment is that could be a really critical funder that if they're not at the table, they're not investing in it. That could be a really critical voice around this table that if they're sabotaging it, it undermines the work. That's why you have to look at it from the largest picture, because that could be true. You just would sequence another body of work, but you would sequence another piece of the work, but you can't do the work by dragging people along. You have to have a coalition of the willing. What that looks like in practice, though, is that your table, whoever the cross-sector group is, has got to be a neutral convener. So if it's a table that's biased and everyone knows that it's Senator so-and-so's pet project, and the person at the table is just the puppet for Senator so-and-so, you're not going to be successful because people don't believe that you really are putting outcomes at the center. So you have to be willing to have a coalition of the willing, and you have to actually invest in a neutral convener and a neutral table that is facilitating the outcomes at the center.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So somebody on the call is asking about whether you have any examples of systems change focused around food systems.
Well, yes, Jeff has a really good relationship on that with Feeding America. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Yeah, just real quick, and I would encourage you all to sort of check it out on your own, is the Feeding America is a national network of food banks in the U.S., and they have an initiative called the Collaborating for Clients, I believe it is, the acronym is C4C. And they are sort of taking this collective impact approach around, you know, issues of hunger in several different communities, and they have been applying a lot of the lessons that Ty has been talking about in those communities, and we actually talk about it a little bit more in the book itself. So I encourage you to check that out, and if you have any more specific questions about that, happy to follow up offline.
Great, and we'll share a link to that as well in our post-call resources. So another question, as the project manager for a collective impact initiative, I'd love your thoughts on how to keep collective partners engaged in the work. This is an ongoing struggle, especially since the work is in addition to the day jobs of most of our partners. So this is something I hear a lot, people trying to do the work off the side of their desk. So what advice do you have for that?
So there are a couple of things I would say. One, this is a place where if you're an adaptive leadership person, they say, give the work back to the group. Well, if everyone's giving the work back to the group, it's like a hot potato. You're not it, you get it, not it. So I would say that there is something real and true about if you leave a meeting and you leave with more action items than you started with, you're not effectively engaging that group. That is like the substance behind the giving the work back to the group. But the other piece is kind of a higher level question. Do you have the right people at the table? If they're not engaged, is it because they're not the right people to be engaged? Do you have the right focus area? So I said something before about prioritization and sequencing. Where is the momentum in the group? And the intrinsic motivation, what that looks like in a collective impact effort is it's something that like the room buzzes about. Like you can feel like the forward momentum. And you should have one or two or other folks that you have deputized as the project manager to be leading that work with you. If you don't have anyone around your table that is excited about leading that work with you and willing to show that excitement by activities, then it's probably not the right partner or maybe not the right work. But there is actually just a lift in general. And I think this is underestimated. It's a lot of work to convene people to do this. You're doing schedules, you're making agendas, you're making sure that so-and-so isn't mad at whoever before they got in the room. You're telling the person in charge of the initiative to make sure they call somebody beforehand. That is just some of the work. But it should not be the only work. It is in service of when people come to the table, they have done the work they need to leading up to it, so those meetings are productive, and you have set the space and the environment for them to be able to move the work forward when they're in the room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Another question. What are some of the inherent risks involved when reaching out, collaborating with the for-profit sector?
So I push people because I think this is the hardest part, and this is my prioritization area for the next couple of years on this work. All sectors have risks. In fact, one of the data series talks about data and what the risks are for profit, nonprofit, and government. So I would push everyone to say, are you over biasing yourself on private sector's risk and over like raising up nonprofit or government? That said, the risks are generally collective impact is just kind of the way the private sector does business internally. And so with a lot of yay, isn't this amazing, or this is new and no one has figured it out for the social sector, the private sector, what it takes to build a locomotive, which I mentioned before, means that you have to have the plastics people together to make sure the equipment is together, and the mechanics, and the sales people, and the finance people. It's little cross-sector partnerships within the company all the time. And all of these people are really different from very different backgrounds with different motivations. And so the way the private sector works is data in the middle. Are we making money? Yes or no? Let's do it. Let's stop. That's just how they work. So most of the private sector has a hard time coming in on the front end of a collective impact effort. It's kind of like, wait, when do we get to the point where we're doing stuff? So that's one risk. Another risk is that sometimes they just use it for PR. So you have to make sure that they're actually there for the right reason. Another risk that you find in the private sector, and this is the case for anybody, like I would say the same thing with a PR for anybody. Another thing sometimes you find is like you have to know the way that the private sector is structured. So each company, they're not monolithic. So you need to make sure you have the right person at the table for the work that you're trying to do. Everyone sometimes wants the CEO. It's good to get the CEO bought in, but sometimes the CEO is actually not the person with the power to do what you need. Sometimes it's the chief of marketing. Sometimes it's the head of personnel. Sometimes it's the project manager on the innovation team buried 3 layers down in the organization. So if you don't have the right person at the table from the private sector, sometimes you get really excited because you have them there, but they can't move the work forward. So there's a whole thing on that same Stanford Social Innovation Review about the types of private sector leaders that you need to do this work, what their motivating needs are, and how do you engage them if it's helpful for folks.
Mm-hmm. So we have 2 more questions, time for 2 more questions. So first question, how can community members, we talked about how to engage for-profit, how do you engage the people who might have been marginalized from the change process?
We have a lot of examples of that one. The example I gave in San Francisco, the one I just went over, that group is just incredibly intentional. It's in their DNA about always engaging their residents. And, they're one of the few sites that we have that when we have convenings, they even bring their residents to their convening. It's that much as part of their DNA. We have groups like New Orleans who actually invest in the New Orleans Foundation, invest in the community members to not only be part of the table, but they actually build a pipeline of folks who can be board members. So they provide them capacity building on this is how you sit at the table from a board perspective. This is how, this is the way to present the community perspective, So they do capacity building. And then Jeff, maybe you can give the Minneapolis example as well, because I know you did a lot of writing on that one.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And we have this example in the book, and we actually have an e-course on our website that answers this question, and it's sort of a 5-week course that you can take for free. So the Minneapolis example is from is a group called Nexus Community Partners, who do a lot of community investment and capacity building, focused specifically on boards, like Ty was talking about, but it's just generally speaking, sort of investing in actually grassroots organizations and trying to build that capacity with marginalized communities. So that they are able to more effectively engage at the sort of grass tops level, and they're intentionally sort of building up the grassroots. And the specific example that we've worked on at Living Cities is around transit planning, so transit-oriented development, and they were able to work with a lot of different hyper-local groups to create an equitable plan for a new transit line that connects Minneapolis and St. Paul. So I encourage you all to check that out on our website.
Great. We can include a link to that one as well. Okay, last question. How do you get a partnership to contribute equally to moving forward? So this was related to that previous question, but I think to expand upon it. So when some expect the backbone organization to take the leadership role, how do you get that partnership to contribute more equally?
So I mentioned a little bit of that in the answer before about making sure you're effectively engaging. So I'll say a couple of other things on that. One, people have talked about backbone and backbone organization. The backbone is supposed to be the neutral convener. The work is supposed to be everybody's. So that's something that has to be clearly articulated, and the people who are playing that backbone role have to consistently not just say it, but reinforce those concepts. A way we often see that works is you start to engage other members of the collaborative to lead certain pieces of the work. So if you're the only one speaking every time you have a meeting, you're probably not putting some of the accountability and ownership on the other group around you. But the other piece I would say is I'm married and I love my man, and everyone says it's supposed to be 50-50, but it actually averages out to be 50-50, and sometimes. Actually, I won't get into all that detail, but I will tell you that some things are 70-30 for me, right? Other things are 40-60. So it's not about everyone won't equally contribute everything at all times. And so some of the role of the backbone organization and functions is the conductor. How are you making sure, a conductor, not like a train, because I've been talking about locomotives, but more like an orchestra. When it's time for the flutes to come in, are they singing at their best? When it's time for the drums to go, is it a seamless transition? Like, how are you orchestrating the music of your collaborative as opposed to kind of a pie that you cut equally and everyone gets a slice?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Ty. I really appreciate all of your examples and how animated you are in describing this work. It's inspiring. So thank you to you. Thank you to Jeff as well for jumping in here and answering some questions. Over to you, Steph.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And just to echo Lisa's comments, we've had quite a few people on the line mentioning how they loved your presentation style, Ty, and how your enthusiasm is contagious and inspiring. So thank you so much for being so animated for us in the past hour. That's been so great. And thank you to everybody on the line. All your comments and questions helps make this a dynamic and thought-provoking conversation. So thank you guys for joining us. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, again, Human Resources and Social Development Canada, Maytree Foundation, J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, the Province of Ontario, and the Suncor Energy Foundation, again, for making these calls possible. As promised, and I know a few of you have been asking, we're going to be emailing you in the coming days with links to all of the resources that Ty's mentioned, as well as the audio recording of this presentation and any other materials related to today's call. So we also welcome your feedback. Don't hesitate to email us here at Tamarack and let us know how we're doing on these calls. Just want to touch on a few upcoming events for you guys to stay in touch with us here at Tamarack. For those of you interested in collective impact, you'll want to join us in Kitchener, Ontario from May 9th to 11th for the debut of Collective Impact 3.0, a multi-day learning event that will bring together leading thinkers and practitioners of collective impact to accelerate the effectiveness of this evolving field of practice. We also have the Deepening Community Learning event that's taking place in Montreal this year from June 6th to 8th. And this event is all about neighborhoods, and it will bring together community leaders and neighborhood builders from across North America to learn about how to mobilize for impact. So if you want any more information about these two events, feel free to visit our website, or you can reach out to me at stephanie@tamarackcommunity.ca. Finally, we're always researching and writing about the latest in community change, so we invite you to visit our website, tamarackcommunity.ca, to learn more and sign up for our monthly e-magazine, Engage. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.